Hey, and how you doing, folks? Yours truly, Randy Rand here, and welcome to another edition of today's talk. Today we spoke to Shantella Y. Sherman, and she authored the article "Study: D.C. Whites 80 Times Wealthier Than Blacks," and just hearing that title alone just blew my mind. We talked a bit about a little bit why that's the case, and certainly what African Americans can do to improve their financial status with regards to saving and cutting some corners as far as realizing what's important. Whether it's travel, buying a new car, or going on vacations, as opposed to putting money aside for your college education for your children. A very thought provoking interview because it only opens the dialogue up for more opinions and thoughts. And it was a great interview. It was a great interview. Uh, Hope you enjoyed the interview and thank you for the time. And we're back. Yours truly, Randy Rand here for another edition of today's talk. Welcome. And today we're talking with Dr. Shantella Y. Sherman. She authored the article, which is entitled Study: D.C. Whites 80 Times Wealthier Than Blacks. And upon seeing this article, Dr. Sherman, I was quite blown away just by the title alone. And I just had to reach out to you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
And I just want to remind our audience that you are the publisher of Acumen Magazine. You are a historian. Your work documents African American history, pop culture, women and gender studies, Black British culture, and the American eugenics movement. I'm going to begin the interview by asking you about the article. And in the article, you mentioned that there was an overall lack of fluid money, investment, set asides, and savings. Now, that's quite a tall order of financial responsibilities to assume. Are we to assume that before the Great Recession, blacks or minorities were able to meet these financial obligations?
To some extent, African Americans have had enough financial fluidity. There are times when it's been more stagnant, but our ups and downs financially tend to move along the same grid as every other American. I think what happens, we have to be clear about the role of blacks in what I term the consumer republic. So we're constantly hearing stories about the number of trillions of dollars African Americans put into a consumer republic. So there is money there. It's just about the allotment of where it goes. So there was a time when we understood that because of market forces and racial bias, we cannot participate in some ventures. Now it almost seems as if we feel obligated to show our Americanism, who we are as African Americans, by constantly purchasing things that we don't really need, that we tend to have to replace quickly. Now it almost seems as if we feel obligated to show our Americanism, who we are as African Americans, by constantly purchasing things that we don't really need, that we tend to have to replace quickly.
Okay, now speaking on a broader level, do you believe that this problem needs a policy fix? And if so, what type of policies would you like to see developed?
I don't think that a policy um, is really the issue. I think it really goes more to again what we believe we need or don't need. Because again, African Americans in this country, there's always been that racial bias. There's always been instances where we could not join the union. We were being paid less than others. We may have been working 2 or 3 jobs in order to purchase the house and things like that. You cannot legislate beyond race sometimes because there's always people who don't want you in their neighborhoods. They understand white flight. The banking system understands redlining certain areas. They understand conscripting how you get your loans and taxing you out so that you're unable to pay them back. So there's always a equal and opposite reaction that penalizes some of us even further when you try and set policy.
Now, with regards to finding and keeping suitable employment, Do you believe that job spatial mismatch plays a part in the inability to find and keep employment? Please explain.
In that instance, there do need to be some programs, I think, that would definitely benefit, especially younger African Americans. I think that there needs to also, we have to also understand that there has to be a certain level of adaptability. This is not new. The country goes through these cycles all the time
Mm-hmm.
where an industry shuts down, whether it's a plant or whether it's munitions or it's, we were having a heavy war industry to the plants in Detroit with the car industry and things like that. At one point, we went through an entire boom where every black person wanted to go into computer programming because we were moving into a technological age, only to get those degrees and then 2 or 3 years later understand that the system were changing so quickly that you could not keep up with it. This is something that would have to go back to a retooling that a lot of us experienced. I grew up in the 70s, and we didn't have any black males between the ages of 14 and the grade who didn't understand how to fix a car, certain mechanical things, certain electrical things, certain plumbing things. And those things were taught specifically because the industry would shift and change. The things would grow, things would shut down. And as self-contained people, as a race representative, it was always important to have a job and be able to support yourself and your family. So you had more shade tree mechanics as black men or men who went out as plumbers, who could fix things around the neighborhood. And in some instances, they may have been paid equal to or more than what they were being paid at some of these plants, even though they may not have had the benefits, the actual insurance benefits and things like that from it. But it builds a different type of stability. And so I think we may need to go back to, I think a lot of what we're dealing with right now is not being able to connect the dots between what got us over years ago, what sustained us then, and actually built wealth. And when I say wealth, I'm not talking about 25 Mercedes and the 5-car garage and all of that.
Uh-huh.
I'm talking about sustainable wealth, which means when it comes time for your kids to go to college, you don't have to pass a hat around. You don't have to have a go fund. It's something that's excessive. And so we understood that the more black kids were going to college then off of their own parents' dime or aunt's dime or the church's dime, as opposed to the federal government having to come in. And if the federal government said no or you were unable to pay back your student loans, you didn't have to stop where you were. Someone had made preparations for you based on those side jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'm saying. I think it's important that we get back to that type of generational and communal wealth creation as opposed to the individuality that I think has gotten us into a hole.
Yes, and you're leading me right into my next question. In the article, you mentioned that poor net worth sets blacks up for financial instability, parent to child, because each generation is starting from zero, referring to generational poverty, which is dominant in our culture. In your opinion, how do we address this problem so that poverty becomes a thing of the past?
A lot of this, again, is about our mindset. And I may have, I haven't mentioned this, but as a historian, I look a lot at the American eugenics movement. And eugenics is a science which says that African Americans, for the most part, are biddable. We spend money, we have no impulse control. So we are an advertiser's dream. We have to get to a point where we stop running out to purchase things that are not a necessity. When we have Black Friday and you race out to buy a flat screen TV, but the TV in your house is not broken, there's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't need it, it is not on sale. We just have to get really clear about what it is that we're doing. Our family Christmases are spent at local family shelters where we're reading to hundreds of children who are living inside those shelters. We're passing out hugs and smiles and company to senior citizens whose kids and grandkids stopped coming by as soon as they could no longer get a plate of food.
We are speaking to Dr. Shantella Y. Sherman. She is the publisher of Acumen magazine. She's a historian, and her work documents African American history, pop culture, women and gender studies, Black British culture, and the American eugenics movement. And she's so very kind to give us some of her very valuable time today. Dr. Sherman, I'm going to read a paragraph from the article, and then I'm going to ask you the question. The paragraph states, "The wealth differential is staggering," said William Darity Jr., a professor at Duke University that collaborated on the study with the Urban Institute and the New York's New School. With the findings, we have shown that education does not close the racial wealth gap. That's consistent with what we have found on the national level, but it's far more dramatic here, and here meaning DC. Now, this is
Mhm.
particularly stunning and bothersome to me, Dr. Sherman, I must say, uh, stating that education does not close the racial wealth gap. Now, in your opinion, how is this possible in the 21st century?
Again, I think that a lot of times when researchers examine um, economic disparities, they don't take into consideration the entire lifestyles of African Americans or other groups. And for African Americans particularly, I believe that we still live in a spiritually communal space, meaning those children who gain middle class status and beyond, especially through education, tend to pay it both backward and forward. It's not uncommon to have an adult child like myself caring for elderly or infirmed parents or grandparents while also rearing children and looking after other family members whose finances are stagnant. Many highly educated blacks have exorbitant amounts of financial aid debt to repay. So the reality is that most professional African Americans take on a financial responsibility of at least three households:
Mm-hmm.
their own, their parents or grandparents, and the federal student loan company, which I consider to be an extension of an additional household.
Mm-hmm.
In this instance, while the numbers suggest that there's a problem with that, I consider that to be more of a blessing and a way of inculcating some wealth in the sense that you're not taking household wealth that a senior citizen may have and putting it in the hand of managed care. And instead, if everyone can get along and they're in a communal space, it actually means that that money grows together, and eventually what you may have is a household that's able to send grandkids or nieces or nephews into private education or into college education based on the fact that they've been able to pool money, pool resources, as opposed to living individual lives. So I don't necessarily think that's necessarily an issue. I think that the researchers need to really examine African American culture. Because this is something that goes on constantly, especially in rural areas, in southern areas. The idea of taking on the responsibility of other households within the family as an extension of your own household. So it looks bad on paper sometimes, but
Mm-hmm.
it does the same job sometimes as nesting money.
Okay, now the article states, and I'm quoting, "The report traces the historical trends that have prevented black families from attaining wealth in the region and across the country, from slavery to shortages in affordable housing. Please speak about these historical trends that have prevented these black families from attaining wealth."
Specifically, housing and banking trends, I think, have long accepted or had acceptable practices of charging African American borrowers more interest at greater rates and penalties and with hidden costs. Some of these practices began as early as the First Great Migration through World War I. So as returning soldiers were getting GI Bills like their white counterparts, they were only able to use them in certain areas, or they found that there were restrictions on the way that they were able to use their benefits. If you pay in more but actually have less equity and value to your property, if you want to borrow against it in case of an emergency or to pay for the children's college or something else comes up, there's less to pull from it. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates, his article from June 2014 in The Atlantic, spoke specifically about one family, Clyde Ross, who moved into a house and the boiler blew out. While that would normally be the homeowner's responsibility, the fact of the matter was that Ross really wasn't the homeowner. He was paying a mortgage to a third party, and so the seller, rather than the bank, actually owned the home. And the agreement that he had signed, it was a predatory agreement that a lot of African Americans moving into Detroit and Chicago and in some cases DC, certain parts of Maryland. They had in between people that banks allowed to go in and basically hustle people. So Ross had bought the house for $27,500. The seller, not the previous owner, was the middleman, and he had already purchased the house for $12,000. So once immediately, the go-between man has already made more money off the house than he actually paid. 6 months before selling the house, he had already purchased it for $12,000. In the contract sale, the seller keeps the deed until the contract is paid in full. Unfortunately, in this instance, this gentleman, if he missed one payment, the entire amount of money that he put in was forfeited. The down payment was forfeited, and the property itself went back to the go-between, the seller, the person who was selling the property. So this man, although he thought he was buying a property, because he was African American, the banks allowed this middleman to go in, own the property, and anything that went wrong with this house, the person who was technically supposedly buying it was actually left with the burden of upkeep, paying for the boiler, the landscaping, the taxes, everything. But he had absolutely no equity in that house until he had paid the entire $27,500. So it seems like that, that the banking system, and that's when you get into that institutional racism that allows unscrupulous people to just constantly build their own net worth off of something like this. So this man eventually lost his home before he could get that $27,500 paid, but he had already paid in a substantial amount. So when Mr. Coates, as a reporter, starts talking about reparations, he's talking about handing money back to specific people who were hindered and lassoed by racist policies that the government and the industry kind of inculcated.
After hearing stories like that, it makes you wonder how in the world do people get away with things like that? That's downright barbaric and stupid, quite frankly. Why would you even
It is, and
why would you even bother wasting your time writing a mortgage like that?
well, and the idea was that, again, as we're trying to assimilate, as African Americans are attempting to assimilate, and whether it's Native Americans, or anyone who's non-white, as you're trying to assimilate into American culture, you want to have the things in hand that say you are an American citizen, that basically validate your citizenship, and that's home ownership. At one point you had Wells Fargo and a lot of other banks talking about home ownership is your birthright and da-da-da-da-da to get you to go ahead and sign off on these mortgages. What they did not tell you was that your mortgage didn't have the same value. It had all types of loopholes, and it was a way of just being a predator and taking advantage of the fact that folks wanted to have the American dream. We want the American dream like everyone else, the house and the white picket fence and the dog and the 2.5 kids and all that. We bought in wholesale because that's part of the American dream. And I think that African Americans take their citizenship rights seriously. And so to turn around and realize that after you've done the work and you've invested and you've put in, that you were shortchanged, and this was something that was on the books that every person of color, a lot of Hispanic Americans have gone through this, a lot of Jamaican Americans have gone through this, anyone who's come to this country and assimilated into the ranks, they've had to deal with this. And so I think that it's important, as a historian, that folks go back and start examining some of these PBS specials. Kim Burns is really good at he did Africans in America, but he also did a whole series, Italians in America, and Jews in America, and Irish in America. And what you find is, as each one of these groups came in, the predators were there to do the exact same thing. The difference is there was a language gap that allowed some of these folks to kind of get in, mimic certain policies and procedures, get into the inner circle of the banks without the banks realizing that they were immigrant descent, and then basically pulling their people out. African Americans don't necessarily have the ability to not be black. So we're wearing basically the litmus test of can you be cheated? And in almost every instance, it's a situation where if people can sway us, then they do. Yeah.
These financial difficulties make it nearly impossible for parents to successfully support their children in their academic efforts, doesn't it? Please explain.
It does, but I think at the same time, there are ways of getting around some of this. I think that parents have to do their due diligence. And I think that years ago, there were, again, certain rules and regulations, even within parenting, that were unspoken. You made sure that your children understood education is key and critical. If you do your part over here to get the grades and to work hard, we are nesting money over here. Sometimes it was you forfeit having the house in order to pay for the education. So in the case of my parents, that's exactly what they did. We're in the District of Columbia, so my parents figured instead of purchasing a home, the investment instead will go into building their educational opportunities. So a lot of that was travel. A lot of that was, if we can get your passport and get you overseas and you can put things into perspective, you'll broaden what it is that you want to do. And those resources will present themselves. And so in the same way that we're trying to push we want to push African Americans towards STEM and towards certain types of careers in order to facilitate the NASA scholarships and the Freedom Forum scholarships and folks who will pay their way. The other part of that is just really being conscious about it's Christmas time. Instead of buying toys, I am investing part of your money. We're not getting shoes. We're not getting toys. We're going to set this aside for an academic trip next year. Or we're going to set this aside so that you can visit the Frederick Douglass home or the African American new museum that's just been built if you're in another state, where we can come to town and do certain things. And in that way, try and figure out exactly what the strengths and weaknesses of your own child, what they are, so that you can steer them properly. Again, a lot of it is getting off of that treadmill, getting off of that hamster wheel, where you're constantly putting money into things that don't put money back into you. Wealth is different from having money. When you're wealthy, the money works for you.
Yes.
As long as you're going to work every day to earn your living, the money isn't necessarily working for you. You have to invest part of what you have back into the system itself or certain industries. In order for that money, you can sit home and the money is actually building its value for you. Money in and of itself, a lot of us are spending our entire paychecks and waiting for the next paycheck to come in. And we have to get to a point where we explain to our kids. I had a bank account when I turned 12. My parents decided, okay, we want you to go into a bank and understand what savings is. This is how this works. If you want certain things, it's fine. I'll invest this much into you getting that, but you need to explain why you want it. That is the other thing. Teaching parents, first of all, to teach themselves. When you say you want something, you have to have a motive for wanting it. And if you want it because someone else has it, that's not good enough. You have to, and then you may get a want every now and again. That might be your one Christmas gift once a year where it's something you just had to have. And a lot of times once we got it, the dialogue was, now that you have it, what do you think of it? And a lot of times it was disappointment. On the TV, this looks shiny. In my hand, this is plastic.
Exactly.
And so when you realize it's just like with the housing industry or anything else, people are selling you something. And you have to learn how to disengage from that on all levels, on every possible level, disengage from it. Parents tell me a lot of times they can't afford that. I don't want to buy books. Books cost too much. Magazines, have things in the house where the children can read and they can tell you different things, and you can expand yourself without turning this television on. Because if you turn the TV on, there are going to be enough ads that are trying to convince you that you need something or that you're not good enough. There are a lot of parents who are putting money into cosmetic alterations for their kids right now. In D.C., that's a weird practice, but a lot of kids get plastic surgery and augmentations of some sort or another as high school graduation presents. These are in the thousands.
Unbelievable.
Right. So my thing is, if you're constantly being told that you're not good enough, if you're constantly being told that you need something else to feel like you're part of the team or part of America or part of your race or a good race representative, you're constantly trying to straighten your hair, bleach your skin, do X, Y, and Z. And the one great thing that I think has come out of a lot of this push is that a lot of African-American women especially have decided no more with the chemical processing of the hair, and just that industry alone you start to see a turnaround where it's like, okay, if you can get the same effect from using shea butter or the mayonnaise in the refrigerator,
Uh-huh.
then we're not giving Revlon $12 or $15 for this, and this. Get used to what you have. Get used to what God gave you.
Sure.
Know what you can and cannot live with or without. And once you start to adjust your own thinking, the kids pick up on that. You know, you'll always have peer pressure to do something.
Sure.
But if your kid said, I want to try drugs because everyone else is doing it, you would have a complete answer for them. It would be a ready answer. When your kids say, everyone has those sneakers and I want them, you feel that you're failing as a parent if you don't get them for them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the conversation. Why do you feel like your kids can do certain things because other folks say it's what they want, but you won't let them do other things?
We are speaking to Dr. Shantella Y. Sherman, and she's the publisher of Acumen Magazine. She's a historian, and her work documents African American history, pop culture, women and gender studies, Black British culture, and the American eugenics movement. And she's so very kind to give us some of her very valuable time here today. Dr. Sherman, what might children miss out on if their parents can't afford either the basics or luxuries their counterparts are enjoying?
Again, I think it goes back to how I grew up in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
There were very few things that I felt I missed out on. And so, again, I think it's more of a mindset than anything else. We went through the whole thing. I think President Obama has been extremely conscientious about the fact that the digital divide was keeping some children from being able to access resources that were online. So the push through HUD and everyone else, make sure every school has Wi-Fi, make sure every housing facility, if it's public housing, has Wi-Fi. And then the charge became, okay, the Wi-Fi is there, but there's no actual mechanism. So in certain school systems, even in South Carolina, when the South started doing this, I thought, okay, this is really catching on. There's a federal mandate. When your kids start school, they automatically get a laptop or a tablet. So they have the mechanics that has their name on it, and they get to take it home so that they can access the resources to, quote-unquote, do their homework. I think everyone is kind of pitching in to make sure that, again, the necessities are being met. I really believe at this point the necessities are being met for most young folks. Again, I grew up in the 70s, so I don't believe that there's this aching problem of not being able to get things. I think there's always a way and a resource to get things in. But I can remember getting on a bus to go to the library, to go through the old card catalog, nothing digital, and find the books. And if the book wasn't there, trying to find another book. But ready access and ready resources are available these days. And it may be that even if the Wi-Fi isn't in your home, if you're able to get to a library, and I know we do have some folks who are, just like they have food deserts, we have intellectual deserts where libraries are not readily accessible, or bus lines to get folks to these resources aren't necessarily there. But I think that becomes the charge for parents, school systems, these elected officials that we keep putting in office and letting them live there and die there and bring their kids into the job that they used to have when they're about to retire. We have to stop that. We have to make demands for certain things, because if I am in the state of Mississippi, for instance, there are students there who are in white, rural, poor neighborhoods who have every benefit that I have here in D.C., in the D.C. public school systems. However, if it's in a black rural area, such as Tunica, Mississippi, what you'll find is that the city council will say, well, let's build a casino here and take the revenue from the casino in order to give the students what they need. You don't do that in white communities, and there's a time and a place to stand up and demand certain things from the folks around you to ensure that all Americans have access to all of the same benefits, so that as a group, as a collective, not based on race, but as a collective, we don't get to a point where we're starting to say the whites are outpacing the blacks, and you're making a projection that this wealth disparity will only get worse. I think that was one of the other things that really got me about this article. The disparity can only get worse, and I'm thinking it may be the case if we don't change our mindset about how we handle money and how we demand certain resources and access to provisions, that the government or the city or the schools are supposed to provide.
I can certainly agree. You just mentioned a moment ago about steering children into STEM careers and STEM education. I myself am developing a program. It's a multi-component program that teaches kids STEM skills and about communications so that they can uh, develop their own messaging campaigns to uh, go against these negative narratives that portray them as animals and such, as well as learning about project management and so forth and so on, as well as building their own websites and so forth. Um, Also, another program that I'm developing that addresses the need of these children that are in the inner cities, especially that do not have Wi-Fi access.
Hmm.
And you just mentioned a moment ago about every public housing building should have Wi-Fi access. I couldn't agree with you more with that. And I agree. We need to uh, steer steer our children into the STEM education and project management and things like that instead of buying them the $150 pair of Jordans or
Hmm.
the most the most expensive outfits you can wear only once or twice during the month, and then in another year you're throwing it away. You know.
Well, and this is the other part of that, which again is troubling to me, is that at one point, parents determined what their children needed, wanted, could have, could not have.
Hmm.
And I think parents are starting to feel pressure from their children to have more and more and more. So what happens, I just spoke with a young lady, and she said, I don't want to wear these jeans anymore. They're like old lady jeans. And I said, well, when did you get them? About 3 months ago. They still fit. There's nothing wrong with them. But she's really in her parents' face right now about she wants something, new because other folks have something new. And so again, a lot of this is just reprogramming.
Hmm.
You will wear what I set aside for you to wear.
Hmm.
I will try and make sure that you have, what you need as well as a few wants. But it's not an issue now of changing, tennis shoes or clothing as the child grows, maybe every year, every other year. It's literally 2 or 3 or 4 times a year. And then sometimes, you buy something and then the child says, well, people made fun of it, so I don't want to wear it anymore. And so it's that type of pressure I think a lot of parents feel, but only the parent can make that stop. And again, I think that a lot of it is too much television, too much um, when the peer pressure that your child is feeling leaves the school, comes into your household, and then you cannot stop it. There's something else that's going on there. So I think across the board, there just needs to be a reexamination of who we are as adults, as parents, as citizens. We have to go back and do the hard work of telling our kids no sometimes.
Like you, I grew up in the '70s, and there were many things that I wanted. To tell you the truth, I grew up in the South. There, in not too far from where you are, there in D.C. I grew up in Virginia,
Hmm.
and a very rural part of Virginia, central Virginia, as a matter of fact, and grew up without running water. Okay,
Okay.
and there were many things that we didn't have, and I wish I could go to my mother and say, "Look, I want a new pair of sneakers because everybody else is wearing Converses, and I got these Skips." You know,
Right. Right.
had I told her that, I would have been skipping down the road because that's where she would have threw me. You know, and like you said, this is where the parents need to be parents and man up and do the work, the necessary work that needs to be done. Our final question is there anything in your opinion that this report doesn't take into consideration?
Again, I think that the color of wealth it speaks a lot of things from the outside in, and by that I mean that the researchers are not from even this particular area. They're not from this region.
Hmm.
So there are a lot of trends that take place in D.C. that are peculiar to D.C. And you have to be in the D.C., what we call the metropolitan area, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, Northern Virginia, most of Maryland, all the way to Baltimore, and then D.C. cut right there in the center to kind of understand this. D.C. is a fluid space It's a space where a lot of people come to go to college, and if they can make their way, they may stay here. But it's almost like a transient space, and I don't think that the researchers quite understood that. There are other issues with DC where, because home ownership was so unstable at one point in DC in the 70s and early 80s, you had a lot of African Americans who went from being working class to middle class to actually having some wealth. And immediately they decided, rather than put my money in a space where eminent domain will allow a baseball stadium to be built and my home to be lost, I would rather move into Maryland or part of Northern Virginia. Prince George's County is an especially profitable enclave that a lot of wealthy African Americans moved out into: Columbia, Maryland, Dumfries, Virginia, where they made it their own. They're property owners, they're land owners, they're business owners, and they literally took the businesses that they had within D.C. and moved them out into those areas where they were. The issue with this, though, is that the research basically reduces everything to black and white. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's a telltale sign that the researchers only scratched the surfaces. I think it was something that was, when you put those headlines out there and you conclude 80% wealth gap, and it's going to only get worse, it's something that will make people take pause. It's alarming. But the truth of the matter is that even within D.C. proper, within the Beltway, there's still real wealth here. There's an area we call the Gold Coast, which is Upper 16th Street. There are areas of Southeast which are considered to be the worst area of the city, which is just a fabricated situation. There are loads of areas within Southeast, the Hillcrest community, and other areas where people own magnificent palatial houses. The waterfront where I live, Southwest Waterfront, is being redeveloped now to our dismay.
Okay.
But it's always been a working class, middle class, and to some extent wealthy area. Dorothy Height used to live right down the street from me. Our mayors and our chiefs of police generally lived in this community. So we understood, by seeing poverty at one end, a working and middle class in the middle, a wealthy class on the other end of the spectrum, that anything was attainable. Mm-hmm. And so I think that black flight was never addressed in this article. I think black flight and different standards and different shifts in culture even weren't necessarily addressed when looking at this research, or when the researchers came through to really try and adjust this. I think when you look at the folks coming out of Duke University, I really respect the fact that they decided to come and do this, but that whole area around Duke would lead anyone coming into D.C. to have misperceptions. So they're not easily, you don't easily disabuse people of the stereotypes about D.C. And I've even seen one reporter actually wrote in part of his conclusion that D.C. was still full of ex-slaves and white people who wanted to take advantage of them. Wow. And I just thought, wow, okay. I'm not sure what you saw when you came here, but that could not be farther from the truth.
We have been speaking to Dr. Shantella Y. Sherman. She's the publisher of Acumen Magazine. She's an historian, and her work documents African American history, pop culture, women and gender studies, Black British culture, and the American eugenics movement. And she's been so gracious as to give us some of her very valuable time today, and we thoroughly thank you, Dr. Sherman. And in closing, please feel free to plug any project that you're involved in, or your website, or whatever.
First, I would like to encourage anyone listening to you, all folks listening to you, to please support your African American newspapers. I've freelanced for the Afro American newspaper, which is out of D.C. and Baltimore. They have a Baltimore office and D.C. satellite office. They have been doing the work of documenting African American culture, life on a weekly basis since 1892. All right, when African Americans get in trouble, there's a real crisis going on. The Washington Post, AP, Reuters, they're not going to report your story using your voices. Only the Afro and the groups of newspapers built and established by African American families they are the only ones that are going to go into the community to really find out what's going on. So please, the subscription rates are still relatively low. You can afford them, and we want to make sure that we're constantly putting your voice in the paper as opposed to some random person who's trying to assess what it is that you may be thinking of doing. Also, I encourage folks to visit my website. The Acumen magazine is on the website, the Acumen Group. Our job is to help reporters understand the historical framework in which they should be writing, and also to encourage historians to look at old newspaper and magazine articles so that they understand that nothing happens within a vacuum. As you are reporting and documenting African American life, you need to always understand that whether it's Trump or the idea of super predators or the idea of African American brilliance or laziness or anything else, it does not happen in a vacuum. And we've visited these things before. We need to know how they were dealt with in the past to understand what our response and reaction should be to them in the future. On the website, since I study eugenics, African Americans, and the culture of belonging and fitting in and assimilation, my book, In Search of Purity, examines African Americans who accepted eugenics and how that has impacted our assimilation into American culture. I invite you to go to the website, click a couple of buttons, purchase the book, and if you have questions, the website has links so that you can ask me questions, and I always answer you back.
Okay. We again thank you so very much, Dr. Sherman. This has been a one of the more chock full of information interviews that I've ever done, and you certainly did not disappoint. I certainly look forward to having you back on the show, as you will then become a friend of the show, and we certainly hope that this is the beginning of a very long and fruitful relationship.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me, and anytime, I'm more than welcome to join you again.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Sherman. You have a great day.
You too.
All righty.